Welcome back to some microeconomics. And today, what we are going to talk about is we are finally moving away um, from perfectly competitive markets, and we're going to talk about imperfectly competitive markets and imperfect competition. And we're actually only going to focus on one today. But before we do that, I do want to create a spectrum to hopefully understand what the different types of competitive markets are that exist. So there are four typical markets that exist here in economics, and we're gonna range these from the least competitive to the most competitive. So what does competition do, right? What does this even matter for, right? Well, first off, what determines competition? All right, what determines whether a market is competitive or not? It's usually two key things, right? So these are causes of competition, right? Two key things. Number one is the barriers to entry, right? How many barriers to entry are there? Are there any barriers to entry? How much can they kind of halt people from joining a market? And the second one is the ability to have non-uniform goods, or let's call it the uniformity of the good being sold. Okay, so in our gasoline market we've been using, right? It's all the same, right? Gasoline's the same everywhere, right? Um, yeah, there might be diesel, but still, the idea is that most gas stations all have the same type of gas, right? But in other markets, like maybe the smartphone market, right, those goods, while being similar in a lot of ways and have the same fundamental baseline function, there are a lot of differences that make them a little bit not similar, right? Or you could then go all the way to something um, like railroads, right, or planes, right? There's nothing quite like a plane, right, flying on a plane, which could create some situations. Now there might be differences between plane holders, right, plane providers, and stuff like that. How about electricity, right? There's nothing quite like electricity, and when you only have one person supplying it in an area, right, you might get something monopoly like. So these two things in turn lead to determine the amount of competition available, right? And the amount of competition available, excuse me, in turn leads to the ability to price discriminate, right? I shouldn't say price discriminate. I'm sorry, that's the wrong term. The ability to set price, and that is due to the amount of market power you have. Right. So if you have no market power, as we've been seeing with perfectly competitive markets, you cannot set the price. Right. But if you do have market power, you can set the price. Right. Okay. So up here on this spectrum of least competitive to most competitive, we've been talking about the most competitive quite a bit. That is the perfectly competitive market. Okay. The least competitive market, you all know the term for. You've heard it many times before. It is monopoly. Okay. Now, what is the second least competitive type of firm? Now, there's actually technically duopolies, right? Two firms in control, but we're going to go to oligopolies, right? Oligopolies where a few firms control the entire market, very similar to an oligarchy, right? Where only a few people control a whole government. And then lastly is the monopolistically competitive market, which is probably the hardest to understand. Monopolistically competitive markets have both traits of a monopoly and a perfectly competitive market, right? And that allows for them to A, have similar goods, but B, have just different goods enough to, you know, have some market power, right? Okay, so today, though, what we're going to look at solely is the most extreme version of this, and that is monopoly. Okay, so let's talk about monopolies, right? And actually, before we talk about monopolies, I want to very briefly kind of go over what the goal of a firm in a non competitive market is, right, or a non perfectly competitive market is. So, what is the goal of any firm? That is to maximize revenue, or excuse me, maximize profit. Haha! I caught myself in my own trap. Right, maximize profit. Now we saw in a perfectly competitive market, to maximize profit, it was to find the place where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Right. Well, in all three of these other markets, it's the same thing, right? You still want to produce at marginal revenue equals marginal cost, right? The question, or the thing that becomes here that we'll see pretty soon, is that this place is different for these three markets, right? Where marginal revenue equals marginal cost is going to be very different for these different markets, okay? All right. So monopoly, first off, let's get the easy part here. Is obviously going to be a single supplier of a good. There's also a thing called a monopsony, which is a single demander of a good, single consumer, but we're not going to talk about that. And so monopolies occur because of barriers to entry. Right? Barriers to entry cause monopolies to happen. And there are three major types of barriers to entry. Okay. So the first one is the ownership of a key resource, right? If you're the only person who owns a resource that's used to make a product, then you have a monopoly, right? The example they bring up here is the De Beers Diamond Company, right, which until recently had 80% of the entire global supply of silver, or excuse me, of diamonds. Okay. So that basically gave them a monopoly. Secondly, is government created monopolies. Government created monopolies. Okay. So government created monopolies are done to protect people's rights when it comes to creating a new product, right? All right. So the two key kind of ways to create government created monopolies are patents and copyright. So a patent gives somebody the sole production of a new invention for 20 years. Copyright gives an author monopoly over their book for a certain number of years as well. Right. I don't know how long this one. This one is longer because of the Disney laws. Right. Disney has basically been changing the copyright laws every year to make sure that Mickey the Mouse can't be widely distributed by non-Disney companies. Right. So these are two major ones, but also you can see situations where the government will create monopolies for other reasons, right? But these are definitely the two we want to focus on: patents and copyright. And the reason that you do this is to incentivize innovation. All right, that's why a government would create these laws, right? Is to incentivize people to create new things, so that and so now that this occurs, they make more money off of their inventions. Lastly, is a natural monopoly. Now, I think this one's the least well explained by the resource, so I'm gonna try a different angle. Okay. In a previous section, we talked about the concept of diminishing returns to scale. Right. We talked diminishing returns to scale. If you don't remember, is that as a company continues to increase their output of a good, right, the costs associated with producing that good at some point outstrip their revenues, right? Their marginal revenue. Basically, that the more they try to produce of a thing, then the more inefficient their inputs, their costs are to helping make that product, right? When we talked about bread, it was a scenario where they had filled the entire bakery with ovens, but hiring more workers to work on those ovens wasn't necessarily going to produce more. Instead, you're just going to be paying more people, right? Natural monopolies do not have diminishing returns to scale. In fact, they have increasing returns to scale, or at the very least, non-diminishing returns at scale. So what that means is that they almost have an infinite scaling situation where the more of that good they are producing, the cheaper it is for them to produce it, right? Right. So the more production, right, the cheaper it is to produce each unit, right? The cheaper it is to produce the marginal unit, which is the next unit. All right. So the examples they brought up here, like railroads, right? If you think about, the construction of railroads, right, that you have this situation where if you are producing railroads, right, if you're producing 1 mile of railroads, you have to get all this metal, you have to get all these workers to put it down, you have to get all this wood, right, you have to get all these rocks and all this stuff, right, and so for you to use to get all the resources for just that one railroad takes a lot of money. But at that point, once you've created the ironworking, once you've hired all the laborers, right, the more you can do that, right, it actually becomes cheaper, right, to produce it going forward once you've kind of secured those different resources, right. So that's why that is a natural monopoly. Okay. All right. So those are the 3 major barriers to entry. Okay. So now what I've done is I've created a supply and demand curve. We're going to use this more in a kind of more ethereal concept than the resource uses, because I want to talk about what this looks like, right, and what this is. So this is our supply and demand curve. Now, what I first want to do, or what else I want to do here, is I want to put, what I want to do is I want to put I want to put 2 curves onto this particular graph. The first one I want to put the demand curve faced by, or the marginal revenue curve faced by a perfectly competitive market, right? So if you guys recall, when we talked about a perfectly competitive market, right, we talked about how their marginal revenue was actually a flat curve, right? And that flat curve is at whatever the equilibrium price is, right? This is the marginal revenue curve for a perfectly competitive market. Why is that? Well, again, in a perfectly competitive market, there is no market power, right, for an individual firm. So because of that, right, their increase or decrease in production doesn't impact equilibrium. Doesn't impact equilibrium. With a monopoly, that's no longer true, right? And in fact, what we're going to see here, right, in a monopoly curve, right, they actually do face the demand curve, right? They face what's called, they face a downward sloping demand curve. Now, we've been looking at downward sloping demand curves this whole time. What is different here? Well, essentially, if you want to look at it in a certain way, is that when we looked at perfectly competitive markets, right, the first part is that the if they go above price, then what's going to happen is that nobody's going to buy from them. If they go below price, well, they're already working at a zero economic profit, so they're going to exit the market. So essentially, they have this horizontal demand curve as well, right? So what we see here is that monopoly is facing a downward demand curve, and so essentially, this is the monopoly demand curve. Oops, excuse me. This is the monopoly demand curve right here. Okay, so what's going to happen with this monopoly demand curve? Well, they're not actually facing this demand curve per se, or they are, right? They definitely are. But what we're also going to have to create is a new marginal revenue curve, because as we saw here, right, we've kind of gathered that this marginal revenue curve equals the demand curve for a perfectly competitive market, right? But the marginal revenue curve for a monopoly actually looks like this. Okay. Now, why does it look like this, right? Well, let's try to solve this out, right? Let's say that a company moves from this price here to this price here on the market on the curve, right? Well, what's happening is that as they move to this new curve, right, they might be making more revenue on the whole, but since they're decreasing the price, right, they're actually making less money per unit, right? And so because of that, the marginal revenue is decreasing. Okay. And the marginal revenue is decreasing at a slope that is more steep than the demand curve, right? They don't face the demand curve, they face this marginal revenue curve for monopoly, right? So just intuitively, right? Again, I hope that makes sense. As you decrease the price of a good, right, you're getting less revenue per unit, right? Your marginal revenue will decrease. Okay. So where we would see in a perfectly competitive market, right, we would see we would see them produce here at this particular equilibrium, right? A monopoly is not going to produce at that equilibrium. Instead, they're going to produce at the same place that's a perfectly competitive market would, right? Which is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Okay. And for here, right, marginal, we're gonna go ahead and say that marginal cost is the supply curve, right? Just to keep it easy. I don't think that's necessarily true, right? And so we're gonna say that the monopoly is going to produce at this quantity. Okay. So we have our equilibrium quantity for a perfectly competitive market, and we have our quantity for a monopoly, right? We have our price for a monopoly, and we have our price for a perfectly competitive market, right? Now, so we see here that in a monopoly, we are going to have a situation where the quantity produced is less and the price it is sold at is higher, right? And this makes sense because what we're seeing here is that they are producing where their marginal revenue equals marginal cost, right? So what does this mean, right? What's the impact of this, right? So the impact of this is kind of twofold, especially when it comes to surplus, right, to welfare, right? So basically, we have a whole chunk of people from here to here who are no longer buying this particular good, right? Because the price is too high, and they would have bought it at a market price, right, an equilibrium market, but because they're in a monopoly, they're not going to buy it. So what we're seeing here is this whole chunk, right, this whole space is going, this whole space is going over to monopolists, right? On top of that, this space right here has disappeared into dead weight loss, right? This is now all disappeared, right, in the monopolist market because they are not selling everything they should be, right, at the where it should be at equilibrium level, right? So a couple things here, right? So a couple consequences. Number one, consumer surplus has decreased significantly, right? As we can see here, it would have been at this yellow curve, this yellow line, right? But instead, it is only up here, right? So we see consumer surplus decrease significantly. Number two, we see total surplus also decrease significantly, as we just saw with that dead weight loss, right? So that's not good, right? And so, but there's nothing anybody can do because they're a monopoly. There's barriers to entry, right? They're very likely not going to be able to deal with this. Okay. Or nobody else is going to be able to really do anything here. Okay. So hopefully that's a good explanation of how monopoly curves work, right? I know this supply equals marginal cost is not a great example. I should really probably put this as marginal cost from the get-go, because that's for our purposes it makes a little more sense, right? But remember that a monopoly is going to play where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, just like a perfectly competitive firm. However, their marginal revenue curve is much different from the marginal revenue curve of a perfectly competitive market. Okay. All right. So let's talk about how to deal with monopolies. So how does a government interact with monopolies, right? Um, Now, because of these negative effects, right, this deadweight loss, this decrease in consumer surplus, right, governments tend to not want monopolies to occur, right, and so the governments have created, especially the United States government, have created a lot of kind of different ways to deal with monopolies, but there are two major ones we want to focus on, right. So what we see is kind of antitrust laws, right? To prevent companies from forming these massive companies, especially the Sherman Antitrust Act. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. There's also the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1913, I think, but that's not in here anymore, right? Basically what this says is that mergers have to be reviewed by the government to make sure that they are not becoming monopolies. Okay. The example they talked about was AT&T. Right? AT&T was split up in the 1980s. It has now reformed, but AT&T was split up in the 1980s. So mergers are reviewed by companies. The governments can also break up companies, as they did with AT&T, right? And then they can also restrict anti-competitive practices, okay, which they talked about when they forced Microsoft to stop bundling Internet Explorer, right? So they had to unbundle the Internet Explorer. That's not how you spell Explorer. Internet Explorer from the operating system from Windows OS, right? So basically, it used to be that Internet Explorer was literally in the operating system, and you cannot get rid of it. And they said that was anti-competitive, right? The breaking of companies is the AT&T one, and then the Sherman Antitrust Act said that large mergers and acquisitions have to be reviewed by the government. The second one is regulations, right? General regulations on companies, right? Some examples of this, right? Utility companies tend to be monopolies just because it's a natural monopoly. It's much easier. Utilities being like electricity and water, but they have so utilities' prices are monitored by the government, right? Are basically sent to a government oversight committee to see if the price they're setting is competitive or fair or not, right? Sorry, there's a third one. I apologize. The third one is public ownership of monopolies. And you're seeing this a lot, this idea come up a lot, especially when it comes to internet. There's a lot of argument for governments to start controlling, having public ownership of internet service providers, right? But the example here, right, is things like sewage, right? Sewage and sanitation companies are usually owned by local cities, owned by city governments, right? Because you don't want people to not get sewage and sanitation, right? That's just it's like a public good in that way, right? All right. So we've been talking about this one price that monopolies can set, but what if monopoly could set multiple prices for multiple markets, and that's in multiple markets for multiple consumers? Well, guess what? They can. That is a term known as price discrimination. So price discrimination is the ability of a company to set different prices for different parts of the market, right? What this can do, if we go back to this curve up here, if you could create perfect price discrimination, right? Basically, what that means is that the monopolists could literally set every single price along the curve as the price to the person who wants that curve, to wants that good at that price. Right? They could basically tell this person up here, right? Hey, you can have it for this. This person here, hey, you can have it for this, right? Basically creating a scenario, right, where every single part of the curve underneath here, basically this entire triangle is now producer surplus, right? They could create a scenario where they capture all of this surplus right here by using perfect price discrimination. Now, perfect price discrimination doesn't exist. It's not a real thing, right? But what they can do instead, right, is maybe instead of trying to capture, instead of trying to capture every single price along here, right, maybe they could set one price at this high level, and then they could set another price at this level to capture, this new second chunk right here as well, right? They could capture this quantity right here, and kind of add that into their surplus, right? And so, what are some of those examples of price discrimination? Well, there are things like different when they talk about cable companies, which I know what's cable anymore. We all watch stuff on the internet, right? But cable companies have different bundles, right? There's a sports package, right? There's a movie package, right? There's all these different packages, and so what they can do is basically overcharge or sell extra, make extra money off of those people who want more stuff, right? And they're willing to pay for it, right? They've decided that that's something they're willing to pay for, right? Another thing you can talk about is senior citizen discounts, right? When senior citizens, want to go to a restaurant, but they can't afford it, giving them senior citizen discounts will encourage them to go there, right? Also for children, right? Discounts for children, right? They talk about airlines for Saturday nights, staying over the night, right? Saturday night travel, because nobody wants to do that, right? And so this price discrimination on the whole increases monopoly profits as well as producer surplus. Right. Okay. So it does increase social welfare on the whole. It increases social welfare / total surplus on the whole. But almost all of that extra surplus is going to the producer, right? So it's not necessarily benefiting consumers anymore. Okay. And I think that's about it for monopolies. Right. So some key things I want to point out again. They operate in the very exact same way as perfectly competitive markets, except that their marginal revenue curves are different, right? A marginal revenue curve for a perfectly competitive market is always horizontal because they cannot affect the price, right? Whereas a monopoly can affect the price because it's literally setting the price because it's the only firm in the market. And so they face a downward sloping marginal revenue curve and a downward sloping demand curve, right? And so because of that, they will produce at a lower quantity and higher price than a perfectly competitive market will, right? That's going to do it. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.